Hey everyone, Joe Glines here and Jackie Sztuk. We're back as normal, so I'm still in Dallas. Jackie's still in Denmark.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're just having some fun talking about coding. So we try to make these where we're not actually demonstrating code. We're just talking about concepts and ideas. And today's short talk, we're talking about using functions versus not using functions. And for me, like, it's not even that long ago. I'd say, well, it's been a while. Yeah, all right, maybe 4 or 5 years, where I started using functions in AutoHotkey, and it what a game changer, right? Of like night and day. The second the first time we were actually on the Codecation when Gabe and I were playing with them, and we're like, let's get into this function thing, and it it took us a while to understand it, but boy, we very quickly grasped that whole being able to pass a parameter to a function and to make your code reusable with, not have to have so many different go subs to go do one slightly different thing, and then go do something else. And then we didn't even get into nesting stuff then at that point, or understanding other things like a static variable, or what's the param where you can have multiple parameters on
A venetic function?
say it again?
A venetic function?
Veratic, yeah.
Yeah.
And that one, for me, it rarely comes up. But when it does, it's great that I don't have to say, here's how many parameters there are, right? Just take out all of these and then go do something with it. But yeah.
To me as well. And of course, writing something small, a small hotkey routine, of course, a function, not really something that you need to know without a hotkey, and just making a small clicker or whatever it might be, that's the same thing. But as soon as you actually want to have a routine that does more than a single line-by-line task, where you actually want to, let's say, repeat the same thing over and over, a function really steps in. And of course, the first thing you do if you're really a beginner is that you'd write a subroutine, go sub. So go to the subroutine, and then it can go there over and over and over. And the function does the exact same thing. The only thing the function does is it actually takes it out of the global scope and puts it into the local scope that is within the function. And it just makes it so much easier to keep track of what's where and what holds what. And one might at the beginning feel like, hey, you can only return a single thing, a single value from the function. But that's actually a good thing. It actually makes you keep track of what you're doing and what's in what. And yeah,
that was the other one, of understanding scope. And for people who are new to functions, right? How would you define scope, Jackie? It's the memory that your syntax has access to, that the things around it.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a good way to put it. But yeah, as AutoHotkey is said to be single-threaded, it's very simple to say that as long as the thread is running, it does so sequentially, and every time it comes past whatever variable you set, no matter how far down that simple one thread is, it will still have that value within those variables that it has come over already. And when you down here might need to get one of them in a subroutine of some kind, it's nice that you can simply just grab it and use it as you see fit. But if you have a need down here to, let's say, use the clipboard once more, it might be more, what would you say, convenient for you to just use the clipboard, or put the data in something that you already know. So the naming of your variables and stuff like that is much more easy to manage. And instead of having the same variable with a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a whatever, old and all of those, by simply passing the contents of the clipboard to a function and doing whatever you need, having all those temporary variables in there, doing your regex or whatever you might need to do, and then returning the result of that. It keeps everything that you had to do temporarily inside the function, so it will not disturb everything else that you actually did within script. So you don't end up at one point thinking, okay, I need this variable 64 that I had used how many steps ago, and now it's empty, or it holds something different, or I don't understand why it's no longer holding the value that I expected.
Right.
And function really, really helps with making sure that doesn't happen.
So just to clarify what Jackie's saying, if you had multiple functions that inside them all had the same variable called today, right? That's the name of the variable. And you were referencing that, the different functions, it wouldn't matter that you had used today in different places, because when you call it inside there, it'll get you the value you expect, but it doesn't go across those, right? And that's the beauty of it, is it's only within there. Now here's the caveat to that, of course, is if you're not used to functions and you try to reference something that was in a variable you created inside of a function, you won't be able to see it automatically, outside of that function. But you can define it as global is one way, or as Jackie said, return the value that you want, right? You can do that. And then I was thinking with a by reference, it's kind of the same way, right? You're passing.
Yeah. That's I'd say that the by ref might be more of a saving memory type of thing. So if you have something very, very large, instead of actually making a copy of it and passing that to the function, you just tell the function the reference where in memory is that large amount of data stored, and then you can work on it. But because you're passing the reference, it is the same thing as passing a variable that is global to the function, because it will actually work on the data at that one place. So the simple data source will be used. So it's a way to also pass multiple things out of a function.
Right. Yeah. So in Python for a while there, it was confusing me that I started using a tuple and could get it outside of the function. But what I started doing when I started learning objects was I would create an object inside my function, and that made it really easy to return everything I wanted outside the function, because I just stuff it into an object. And of course I could also name it the way I want it to, which was really nice. But that's a good point, Jackie. Another way to do it.
Yeah, I really don't use by ref that much, but I'm not sure that I actually handle so big or so large chunks of data in memory that often. But let's say you put something big in the clipboard and you put that in a variable, it might be a good idea. If you're passing on, let's say, a large data file, or if you actually read the entire contents of a very large CSV file or whatever it might be, it could be an idea of passing those by ref instead of actually doing it in the normal copying sense. Again, what we have talked about quite a lot of times, Joe, is that in today's computers, and with the data that you would normally work with, and I say normally because, of course, there's cases where the data is actually big enough to actually be an issue. But most of the time, at least in my experience, is that it can handle it without taking those extra steps to ensure that you're not overusing whatever memory you have available. But it's good to know. That's at least how I see it. It's good to know that that's what you can use it for. But again, within the scope of a function, I've in my recent things that I've been making, I had this very, very sequential thing going, and because because of the way that I think it and that I write it, it comes sequentially, one threaded all the way down. But as soon as I needed to, let's say, have a reuse, as soon as I wanted to make it modular, might be the right way to say, as soon as I wanted to do the same thing multiple places in my code, it started being an issue to have variables that were in the global scope. Because if I was coming here and let's say I'd found the image, so the image found variable was true, and then it would go to the subroutine and do whatever it did, and it would check if the variable found image was true. That's good, but further down in the script, it wouldn't be good for it to just jump in and that still being true. So I needed to always keep track of that variable and set it before going to the subroutine. Where if I just went to the function and didn't actually pass that variable there, I was always sure that I had a clean environment to work with. Yeah. And I recently had it where it needed to check a condition and it needed to do it on a loop. And for that loop to break at a set time without the condition being true, I would first set a variable, let's say a variable that was found, and set that to false. It hadn't been found. That would become true if the condition, let's say the function actually found that one image, if it's images that we're saying. But it also needed to have, let's say, a index and some of the other counts that go on, and it might need to have a timer, how much time has actually passed while it kept looping and looking. And because I needed to do that many times over and in many different scenarios, if I had those in subroutines, again, I would need to think up new names all the time for variables that could hold all of these temporary variables or values, and
which
by using,
Well, I was going to say was that's another actual byproduct of using functions, right? Is when you have a function that can, let's say it's calculating some sort of a value, you don't actually have to save that into a variable. If you just put that into your, the function call, like where you're using it, right? Instead of saving it to a variable and then mention that variable in your code, you just put the function there. It's hard to explain without drawing it, but
exactly. You don't actually need to store the return value of the function. You can use it immediately. So the code or the way the interpreter or AutoHotkey runs over the code is that even though you have one line with, let's say you're calling whatever function it might be a control click or something that you want to perform. But before you actually click somewhere, you need to check the correct coordinates. So you have a function that actually, let's say, checks the screen for something, a red pixel or whatever it might be. And instead of you first calling the function, getting whatever pixel coordinates, storing those in coordinate X and coordinate Y, and then doing a line of command click where you then use the variable coordinate X and coordinate Y, you can just put in the function call right on the place that you need the coordinate X and the coordinate Y, because as soon as the function actually returns the result, the control click will get that without ever using a temporary variable to hold the value. That's a good thing. It's one of the things that you don't really expect to use, but that you will actually end up using more than you believe.
Yeah. The other one is using where you can set a default value for one of your parameter or any of your parameters, right? Which is another thing is you don't have to always pass all of the values, as parameters. You can set some that have as a default, and that way you can just put a couple in, and if you don't want to populate the other ones, you can have default values for them, which is at times really convenient.
Yeah, sure. I use it quite often. But let's say, I'll take almost the same example. You have an X and a Y coordinate that you pass to whatever click function that you have, but you also have a third parameter that might be the coord mode, the coordinate mode to use. And because you always use, let's say, coordinate mode 2 for screen coordinates, that could be your default value for that third parameter. So only in those very, very rare cases where you actually want it to be, let's say, a client-wise coordinate or a screen-wide or a desktop-wide coordinate, then you can simply just pass that third parameters those very, very rare times where you need to do that. That is really useful.
The other thing with the example you just gave me made me realize another time it's still the same thing. It's just why it's beneficial is let's say you find someone else's library or whatever, something they wrote that you like using it, but you don't like how their terminology and how they built stuff, right? So you can make like a wrapper function, and basically you figure it out once of like, here's what I want to call the X and the Y and the Z, whatever it is you want to pass to it, but you put it in your own terms, and then you just adapt the function to stuff it into their function, right? And then it makes sense to you, and it's so much easier because it's in, you've solved it once for yourself, and then it really makes a lot of sense. I did that with a couple things where I'm like, I actually use the other people's stuff, but it, like the image search, the find text one, right? I wrote stuff for that because as much as I liked it, still I'm like, you know what? I want to always pass, like, do I want to click where it finds or double click or right click? Like, why isn't that built into it? So I added that to his and then wrapped it all. So it was just, I pass, I call his thing and then I say whether left click or right click or, whatever. And but it's all intuitive because I wrote it, right? And now it's in my terms. I don't have to rely on, I don't want to rewrite. I like leaving, when people write stuff I don't like monkeying with their stuff, right? I'll just put something around it.
Yeah, I have a very simple one that within one of the scripts that I'm currently writing, I have the need to be able to have the user stop it quite often. It's a very, very long thing, but the user needs to have the ability to almost immediately stop the script from executing further. And to put that in something that made sense, at least to me, and to not have this break condition on every other line, I wrote a separate sleep function. So what it's just named big sleep, small sleep, something like that. Yeah. And the only parameter it takes, or it actually takes more, but the only one it needs, it doesn't actually need it. The only one it normally gets is a number that it then gets, let's say 500. Then it will actually loop for an amount of times. I remember, the way I remember it right now is it actually divides it by 10. So if I pass it 500, it divides it by 10, so it loops 50 times, sleeping 10 each time, but then each time actually checks that break condition. So the idea of that is that it goes into the function to actually sleep, but instead of really sleeping for 500 milliseconds, it actually sleeps for 10 milliseconds 50 times. But each time it checks the break condition. And it's very simple. If I don't pass 500 to it, it has, depending on the function, it has an already preset value. So I can just write big sleep, open and close parentheses, and then I'll have a sleep of a specific size. That will always check for the break condition. It makes it almost as simple as just writing sleep with a number, but now I just write big sleep without anything, and I get both the sleep and the break condition in a single line. And it's very, very convenient, and it's a very, very simple thing to add.
I was thinking about it, and coincidentally in the background, I have AutoHotkey Studio up, and I have a script where I was relying on my Excel function library that I wrote. And that was another one. I'm like, oh, actually, because the syntax for Excel using COM is pretty straightforward overall, but still I'm like, I don't want to read through this little nitty-gritty stuff. And so I can just pass it a parameter, like, where do I want to freeze the panes? What row? Give me a letter and a number, right? And it'll automatically go populate the actual call for me. But yeah, it's really helpful to make me more efficient in what I'm doing, even if it adds a little delay, right? Because that'll take a little more time for AutoHotkey, a slightly bit of time to figure out. But for me, coding wise, it's so much faster and easier, right? And that's what all matters to me.
Yeah, and I'd say functions, I don't know if you actually benchmark it. It might take it a little more time to do whatever it needs to do to actually go into a function. But I've found so few things really, really needing that amount of precision. And I know that I've both helped and read about and people who need a more precise measure than those 10 to 16 milliseconds that are normal, or that CPUs at one time at least had as their most reliable sleep, or whatever it is, iteration or whatever it's called. And to me, it's just why really that doesn't matter if you use one over the other. I know that others do the same thing with commands over functions. Some say that commands are more efficient or faster. And of course, if it's a built-in function and it's the C++ interpreter that's actually running all of what's behind it, yeah, that might be a little faster than a user-defined function, but it's rare to really find a case where that matters enough to not use a function.
The other one, this might be pretty hard to explain without looking at the code, but you introduced this to me, I think, is for things like split string, right, as a function call, where you can, if it's returning an array, and you can just put a .1, .2, .3 at the end of it, and you don't have to store the whole thing in a variable or an object and then go get it. You can just reference that in your actual call, put the dot whatever number you're looking for, and it's not too often I need it, but when I do, I love it.
Yeah, it's kind of to the same fact with the functions that we talked about earlier, that you don't need that temporary variable to use it. So if you have the function definition, or the function call might be the correct word. So you have the function call, and instead of storing whatever array that returns in an
temporary variable or something.
Temporary variable, exactly. The function will still return the array and keep it in memory, but without you defining an actual variable to hold it in. So if you just need the thing that one time, you can call the function, and you can actually, with the way the AutoHotkey syntax works, you can immediately act on the actual content of whatever the function returns. So if the function returns an array, you can actually use arrays syntax around the function.
Mm-hmm.
I find it quite nice, and I've seen it in other languages as well, and it makes a lot of sense if you're used to seeing COM, where that's actually what that's already doing. So if you look at JavaScript, and if you have these get element by tag name or whatever it might be, those already return arrays, and you then just dot and do the next thing, and that thing then acts on that array. So it's actually a need for that syntax to work. So it fits very well with all of the rest of how that works. And we just have very few functions within AutoHotkey that still returns anything other than a single value. It's because everything was written in commands, and those return these pseudo arrays. Do you remember those? Like redx, replace, and whatever they're all called, that actually return these match 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever.
Yeah, I'm back to your point about the commands, and that's one of the things I wouldn't mind switching to version 2 for, is just I really like having, instead of having to use a command at times and break things on more than one line, which is usually, it's not a big deal, it does annoy me for some reason, if I can use a function call instead of a command for the same, like in string I think is one, and even split string I think both have the command line version and function call, and and it's just nice being able to, again, reference it. You don't have to store it in a variable, you don't have to do anything, it doesn't have to be on its own line. It's just really concise, and I can't remember if you said some of this earlier already, but was the speed actually, no, the command lines are fast, right, if I remember right?
Yeah, I haven't really seen that many benchmarks of it, but the command lines are normally the winner on speed there. But again, it's by what I'd call a very small margin. So of course, if you need to, let's say, split 1 million strings to something because you just need whatever is in the middle, you might consider making the loop with a command and those 2 to 3 lines that you need, instead of using string split, the one that returns the array, just because it would save you maybe a couple of seconds, and maybe it would save you some memory. But yeah, it's at that level, because hey, this one takes let's say 36 milliseconds, and this one it takes 46, whatever it might be. It's normally at that level when we're talking about string manipulation, and it becomes interesting when you start doing stuff with images and other stuff where there actually is quite a lot of data. Then those benchmarks where one thing might take 50 milliseconds and the other one might actually take 2 seconds. So that's where it really begins to matter. But in the smaller things,
now
I'm not sure.
This might be completely off topic, but it was just reminding me of a post that you helped me with like 5 years ago, where I was trying to do a SQL query, and I was trying to look up to see if a certain string I was going over like a million lines of code and saying, hey, is this text in this line of code? And my things were taking like 3 minutes, or maybe it was even longer, I forget. But you had suggested stuffing it all into an object and then using it and search over it. And it was like, I think like 100th the time. It was so lightning fast compared to doing it line by line and this and that. But it was that part of stuffing it into an object, which to me was counterintuitive, because I would have thought an object is going to take more time to create the object and do the stuff. However, just because of the way objects are built, I guess they're faster, right? They can be faster.
Yeah, of course, I can't remember the exact things that went before, but one of the things I remember doing at one point was that when you were already doing whatever, you might be string splitting something, or you might already have a loop that was phrasing the line, and then you wanted to check whatever was in the middle of whatever value set you had. If you then instead put those in an object or within an ordered array or what it might have been, you can much more easily loop over them and look at one specific thing if the object is structured in a way that makes that work. So yeah, it might be that maybe we saved a single loop, or we did something else, because I don't believe that the object in itself is actually faster than could have achieved by other means. But the data you had at the time might have had a structure that made sense. One of the things I liked was that object has this one has key. That's one of the things you can do. Yeah. So if you turn your data upside down and put all of what you're actually, all the needles you're looking for, and make those into the keys, you can use that one small function has key and be told that the object holds that key somewhere. So if you're just looking for a single value, that
and it knows like instantly, right? Because it's indexed off of that, so to speak. It's really fast. I think getting back to the reason why this one in this case was faster was because I wasn't just searching for one string. I had, like, let's say a dozen strings. And so to your point, the object, you'd read it in once now instead of reading it 12 times and searching. I read it once and then search for those things the first pass through, all of them, and just flag for it. So that would make sense of why it's faster.
Yeah, because the looping and all of that stuff should be at about the same speed. I don't see how that would really be any real value there. I think the object, for the most part, is just a nice way to structure data. I don't think that I don't think that you get any speed or memory or any type of benefit in that way.
Well, I know in Python, not AutoHotkey, because I remember when I studied Python, a key value pair, the key, Python encodes the key into like the memory address, and so it instantly knows exactly where that is in memory. So it's basically like creating an index to memory to know exactly where that thing is. And I just remember reading this and going, wow, that's why they're so fast when you do this, because it stores them in these spots, right? And so it doesn't have to go look it up. It knows exactly where it is because that's how it encoded it for the whatever. I mean, that's where I get lost on programming side of things. But for that case, I think for Python, it actually, I could see how, again, if you're reading it multiple times, right, it's not searching for it. It knows right where it is. Or to better state it, where it is its definition, right, of what it is. Yeah.
I'd also say that Python is, of course, built totally differently from how AutoHotkey is built. But and I do believe that Python was built with object-oriented stuff in mind. where AutoHotkey has kind of had that added in.
Yep.
So even though the way that we work with objects in AutoHotkey, I believe are as optimized as it should be. It's not born that way. It's
Gotcha.
the mind child of Lexicos or whoever helped him back in the day, whoever first made it. But yeah.
Let's get back on topic. I'm curious, do you know were functions and originally when AutoHotkey was built? Could you create your own functions?
That's a good question. I don't remember actually reading if that.
Yeah.
If that was a thing. No, because AutoHotkey was almost per definition AutoHot version 2, if I remember correctly. So I do believe that AutoHot version 2 already had the functionality when AutoHotkey came into existence. So
cool.
So I believe that it's born with some type of user-defined function. Yeah.
Do you know, does AutoIt have the command line like as AutoHotkey does? Was that ever a thing in AutoIt, or is that something that actually got introduced in AutoHotkey?
I do believe that it's not a hotkey thing, but I'm not sure if it was something they switched over to in AutoIt. They might have done that. It might have been that way in version 1 or whatever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And then they switched over to the function definition way of doing stuff instead, because that's how AutoHot is doing it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. Using functions adds a lot of great functionality. Excuse the pun, and some benefits. But it takes a little bit. So noobs who aren't used to it, it takes a little bit of learning, right? And so I could see how AutoIt, generally speaking, is more for programmers, right, than AutoHotkey is, and I could see how maybe Chris said, let's make this really simple, or let's add even more things to it that are just command line, and it's very clear of like you do this and this comes back, and it's so simple, right? It's ridiculously simple.
The thing that I'm not sure that's where I'm at the moment. I've been for a few years. Is that if AutoHotkey was simply defined with functions, I think the learning curve for new people would be at about the same. I think it's very, very close to each other. Of course, if you first learn the way that command lines work, it seems counterintuitive to learn functions. But if you're all blank, like you know nothing, and you come in and you want the functionality of something like AutoHotkey, learning to use the function definitions and doing function calls, I think it's such a small extra step you need to take. So I'm not sure it really puts people off. I think the community and the help file and stuff like that is what really makes the difference. The only thing is that it might be much more easy for them to transition from the beginning to it's the right word to use mediocre. That's not right?
No, mid-level though. I understand what you're saying.
Mid-level, yeah, to mid-level.
For me, it's mediocre because that's where I am. But yeah, it's
I know what I was saying, but yeah. So that might be a thing, and I do believe that AutoHot still has our community of people who are at just a little bit higher, more
programmers.
They might not be programmers per se, but I think there are have just that extra level
Yeah.
for a wider part of the community, where AutoHotkey has some people who's been using it for a long time, and we have someone who is actually capable of extending the language,
Yeah.
where I do believe that although it might have more people who are able to make very, very advanced libraries for others to use, where we are maybe lacking a little bit in that aspect. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, unless you got something else, let's. I know we don't want to go too long on these, right? I think we had a good discussion. Is there anything else you can think of we should add on to this?
No, just functions are actually great, but yeah, they have their use case. So try
the only
using
thing
in ones first.
The only thing I would comment on is one for a couple things. One is for anyone not using functions, go learn functions. Right? Absolutely, amen. It is the best level up you will ever do of like night and day. You're learning. So if you're not using them, trust me, use them. They're amazing. The second one is just about using them. That's one of the most strongest arguments I have for using AutoHotkey Studio is because inside a function call, you can literally see where you are and what parameter you are and where you're typing, whereas at least Cite doesn't do it. And I don't know about Notepad++, but I don't believe it does it either. And it's really nice to be able to have it show you where, like in a regular expression one Jackie mentioned earlier, there's regular expression, there's a lot of parameters to get passed, and it's really easy to get lost on where you are. Or if you write your own, functions with a lot of parameters, it will show you where you are in it. It'll highlight the color and actually show you, offer up the name of what you're in. And it really makes it a lot easier to work with them to start with.
Yeah, it does. It's really nice to have the built-in functions there with the parameter names and definitions. So that is helpful.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you said that, Jackie, because it's the other thing we didn't mention. We talked mostly about creating your own functions and using them, but there are dozens, if not maybe hundreds, or at least 100 built-in functions in AutoHotkey that you can leverage already, right? It's a lot of them out there that you don't even realize are there. That are really easy to use. And so when I first started using SPSS, it's a statistical language I program in. I would put in certain things, and I'm using like an in-string thing. I didn't realize it, but it's a function, right? No one ever explained to me this is a function, but it had parameters, had to get passed to it. And it never crossed my mind that I'm using a function because everything was hidden in the background. You never saw the code, right? It was just like, do this and you'll get a return to value, but you never saw the actual function code. So once I actually realized that that's a function and I'm passing parameters, it made a lot more sense to me of using functions inside AutoHotkey. Was just, these are things I'm passing something inside of this code that I may or may not see. It's doing something, and then will, generally speaking, either have an effect or return a value that I can then use.
The interesting part with it is also that with functions come kind of by itself expressions, and those are used across all languages. And if you can get the full scope of that into your head, you're really, really far reading code in other languages as well.
That's a good point.
So that's valid to have with you as well. Where commands is kind of AutoHotkey special.
It's a really good point. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, man. This was fun.
Yeah.
Catch you next week. Everyone else, we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.